Japanese soldiers in the cave had been told that if they surrendered to the Americans, they would be tortured, their families would be raped, and their children would be eaten. Death was preferable to capture. This was the message hammered into every Japanese soldier and civilian on Saipan in 1944. So when Private First Class Guy Gabaldon approached their hiding place alone, speaking to them in their own language, telling them they would be treated with dignity, if they came out peacefully, they faced an impossible choice. What happened next would defy everything the military thought it knew about the Pacific War, and it all started with one young Marine who refused to follow orders. The Pacific War was entering its most brutal phase in the summer of 1944. After years of island hopping, American forces were pushing closer to Japan itself, and every mile gained came at a terrible cost. The Japanese military had made it clear to their soldiers, surrender was not an option. The Bushido Code demanded death before dishonor, and Japanese propaganda painted Americans as monsters who would commit unspeakable atrocities against any prisoner. On the island of Saipan, this deadly combination of honor culture and propaganda would create some of the most horrific scenes of the entire war, mass suicides of civilians throwing themselves and their children off cliffs rather than face capture. Into this nightmare walked Guy Louis Gabaldon. Born March 22, 1926, in Los Angeles, California, he was one of 7 children in a Mexican-American family struggling through the Great Depression. His early life was marked by poverty and hardship in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of East Los Angeles. By the time he was 10 years old, young Guy was working as a shoeshine boy on the streets, observing the criminal underworld of Skid Row after dark. The police would throw him candy or buy him ice cream in exchange for information about what he'd seen the night before. Bar girls on Main Street had him run errands, and he'd make an extra nickel added to his daily wage. This was a kid who learned early how to read people, how to navigate dangerous situations, how to talk his way out of trouble. He got into his share of mischief too, caught joyriding in stolen cars, getting into street fights that left him with a broken nose that would be broken again the same night he got out of the hospital. But the most important thing that happened to Guy Gabaldon in those formative years wasn't any of his adventures on the streets. It was meeting the Nakano family. At age 12, something extraordinary happened that would shape the rest of his life and ultimately save thousands of lives in the Pacific. Guy moved in with the Nakano family, Japanese Americans who had taken in this scrappy Mexican-American kid. Living with them, eating their food, participating in their daily life, Guy learned something that would prove invaluable. He learned to speak Japanese. Not the formal textbook Japanese that military interpreters would later use with their bullhorns, but street Japanese, conversational Japanese, the kind of language real people used when they talked about food, family, and everyday life. Think about that for a moment. Here's a Mexican-American kid from the barrio, growing up with a Japanese family, learning their language and culture at their dinner table. He wasn't studying it in a classroom or memorizing phrases from a military handbook. He was absorbing it the way children learn language, naturally, conversationally, with all the nuances and informal expressions that make communication feel genuine. The Nakanos treated him like one of their own, and through them, he gained an understanding of Japanese culture that went far deeper than language alone. When World War II erupted and America entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor, everything changed for Japanese Americans. The Nakano family, like over 120,000 other Japanese Americans, would face the injustice of internment camps, but their influence on Guy Gabaldon had already taken root. When he turned 17, Guy made a decision that would seem almost unbelievable given what was happening to Japanese Americans at the time. He joined the Marines to fight in the Pacific. The Marine Corps in 1943 was not a welcoming place for a Mexican-American kid from East LA, as one documentary producer would later note. Up until Chapao, the Marine Corps was mostly a bunch of white guys. But Guy Gabaldon wasn't there to fit in. He had his own ideas about how to fight this war, ideas that would put him at odds with his commanding officers from the very beginning. By June 1944, Gabaldon found himself with the 2nd Marine Regiment preparing for one of the most important operations of the Pacific War, the invasion of Saipan. The strategic importance of this island cannot be overstated. Located in the Mariana Islands, Saipan was close enough to Japan to serve as a base for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers that would eventually bring the war to the Japanese homeland. The Japanese military understood this perfectly. They had transformed Saipan into a fortress, with 32,000 soldiers dug into intricate networks of bunkers and tunnels throughout the volcanic terrain. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, had given his men clear orders that reflected the brutal reality of Japanese military doctrine. They were to take 7 American soldiers with them for every Japanese soldier lost, or take their own lives. Surrender was explicitly forbidden. This wasn't just military orders. It was reinforced by relentless propaganda that told both soldiers and the island's civilian population that Americans were barbarians who would torture all captured men, rape all women, and literally eat children. This wasn't exaggeration for effect. Japanese authorities literally told people that Americans were cannibals. On June 15, 1944, an armada of 535 ships, carrying 127,570 American military personnel, began the invasion of Saipan. The initial assault was brutal. Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions hit the beaches under withering fire. The Japanese defenders, dug into their positions, made the Americans pay for every yard of ground. This was the environment Guy Gabaldon entered, a hellscape of violence where the enemy was expected to fight to the last man, where surrender was considered worse than death. But from his very first night on Saipan, Private Gabaldon had different plans. As darkness fell over the island and the sounds of artillery and rifle fire echoed across the volcanic terrain, while other Marines dug in for the night, Gabaldon made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who knew what he was planning. He would later recall, "The first night I was on Saipan, I went out on my own. I always worked on my own, and brought back 2 prisoners using my backstreet Japanese." Think about what this means. Here's an 18-year-old kid, on his first night in one of the most dangerous combat zones in the world, deciding to sneak out alone into enemy territory. Not to kill Japanese soldiers, but to capture them. Not with a squad of Marines backing him up, but completely alone. The Japanese soldiers hidden in the jungle darkness were armed, desperate, and had been told that surrender meant torture and death. And Guy Gabaldon walked right into their territory to talk to them. His method was as dangerous as it was simple. He would approach Japanese positions at night, moving through the jungle with only his instincts to guide him. When he found enemy soldiers, instead of opening fire, he would get the drop on them and then speak to them in Japanese, not the formal military Japanese that other interpreters used, but the conversational street Japanese he'd learned from the Nakanos. He would tell them they were surrounded, that they had no choice but to surrender, that they would be well treated if they came peacefully. That first night, he returned to the American lines with 2 Japanese prisoners. His commanding officer, Captain John Schwabe, was furious. Gabaldon had abandoned his post, gone off on an unauthorized patrol, and put himself in extreme danger. Schwabe reprimanded him severely and threatened him with court-martial. In any normal military unit, that would have been the end of it. A private doesn't disobey orders and wander off into enemy territory on his own initiative. But Guy Gabaldon wasn't interested in being normal. The next night, despite the threats of court-martial, despite direct orders not to leave his post, he went out again. This time, he had learned from his first experience. He approached a cave where intelligence suggested Japanese soldiers were hiding. These volcanic caves were death traps, dark, confined spaces where Japanese soldiers could hold out indefinitely, where one man with a machine gun could hold off an entire platoon. Gabaldon moved carefully to the mouth of the cave. He could hear voices inside, Japanese soldiers talking in the darkness. In conventional marine tactics, this cave would be cleared with flamethrowers or sealed with explosives, killing everyone inside. But Gabaldon had a different approach. He pulled the pin on a grenade and threw it into the cave, not to kill, but to announce his presence. As the explosion echoed through the volcanic chambers, he called out in Japanese, "You're surrounded and have no choice but to surrender. Come out, and you will not be killed. I assure you will be well treated. We do not want to kill you." The silence that followed must have felt like an eternity. Gabaldon stood there, exposed, knowing that at any moment machine gun fire could cut him down. Then he heard it. Whispered conversations from within the cave, Japanese voices discussing, arguing. And then, incredibly, one by one, soldiers began to emerge from the darkness. Not just one or two, but dozens. By morning, Gabaldon returned to the American lines leading 50 Japanese prisoners. This time, Captain Schwabe's reaction was different. 50 prisoners captured by a single Marine without firing a shot except for that warning grenade? This was unprecedented. Military doctrine said Japanese soldiers didn't surrender. The intelligence reports all confirmed it. The casualties American forces were taking proved it. Yet here was this 18-year-old private proving everyone wrong. Schwabe made a decision that would change everything. He gave Gabaldon official permission to operate as a lone wolf scout. Think about what this meant in military terms. The Marine Corps, built on discipline, chain of command, and coordinated unit tactics, was essentially telling a private to go do whatever he thought best. It was an admission that Gabaldon's unorthodox methods, as crazy as they seemed, were working better than conventional tactics. Over the following days and nights, Gabaldon continued his solo missions. He would later say, "I never ceased to be amazed at the stupid carelessness of the Japanese. Time after time, whenever I got the drop on them, they had left themselves completely exposed. The first time it happened, I suspected a trap, but later I realized that they were just plain baka stupid." But this wasn't really about Japanese carelessness. It was about the fact that they never expected a single American soldier to approach them, speaking their language, understanding their culture, offering them a way out that preserved some measure of their dignity. The battle for Saipan was intensifying. American forces were pushing the Japanese defenders north, compressing them into an ever smaller area. The Japanese military response was becoming increasingly desperate. Civilians, men, women, and children who had been living on Saipan, were being caught up in the fighting. Japanese military authorities were telling these civilians the same propaganda they told their soldiers. The Americans would torture and kill them all. Military police were actually forcing civilians toward the cliffs at the island's northern edge. On July 7, 1944, the Japanese launched what would become the largest banzai charge of the war. 4,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians threw themselves at American lines in a suicidal assault that lasted more than 15 hours. The attack temporarily overran both Army and Marine positions. The casualties were horrific. The count rose above 30,000. It was organized mass suicide disguised as a military tactic, the logical endpoint of a culture that demanded death before dishonor. That night, as this massive banzai charge was being prepared, Guy Gabaldon was out on what he called an evening patrol. He could hear enemy soldiers moving through the jungle around him, thousands of them preparing for the assault. He realized with growing alarm that he was cut off from American lines. Trapped behind what would soon become a human wave of desperate Japanese soldiers throwing themselves at American positions. For 15 hours, the banzai charge raged. Japanese soldiers with rifles, swords, and even bamboo spears hurled themselves at American machine guns. It was slaughter, purposeful and deliberate. The Japanese soldiers knew they were going to die. That was the point. They were trying to take as many Americans with them as possible, while dying in a way their culture deemed honorable. When dawn broke on July 8, 1944, the banzai charge had spent itself. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay dead on the battlefield. The survivors had retreated to their caves and hiding places in the cliffs of northern Saipan. And Guy Gabaldon, somehow still alive after spending the night behind enemy lines during the largest suicide attack of the Pacific War, prepared for what would become his most extraordinary achievement. The scene at the northern cliffs of Saipan that morning was one of unimaginable horror. These weren't just military positions. They were volcanic cliffs dropping hundreds of feet into the sea, and they were packed with both Japanese soldiers and civilians. What Americans would later call Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff were about to become the sites of one of the war's most horrific tragedies. Japanese military authorities, along with the relentless propaganda about American atrocities, were literally pushing civilians to jump to their deaths rather than face capture. Gabaldon approached the cliffs with 2 Japanese prisoners he had captured that morning. These weren't hardened soldiers, but guards who had been posted at cave entrances. He spoke with them at length, not interrogating them but conversing with them, using his street Japanese to establish human connection. He told them about the medical treatment wounded Japanese were receiving from Americans, about the food prisoners were being given, about the respect with which they were being treated. These weren't abstract promises. Gabaldon could point to the American ships offshore, to the medical stations that had been set up, to the prisoner collection points where Japanese who had already surrendered were being processed. Then Gabaldon did something that required extraordinary courage, or perhaps extraordinary faith in his ability to read people. He convinced these two prisoners to go back to their own people with a message. They were to return to the caves where hundreds of soldiers and civilians were hiding and convince them to surrender. I pointed to the many ships we had lying offshore waiting to blast them in their caves. Gabaldon would later recall, "Why die when you have a chance to surrender under honorable conditions? You are taking civilians to their death, which is not part of your Bushido military code." This was the key to Gabaldon's approach. He didn't challenge the Japanese concept of honor. He reframed it. He argued that there was no honor in leading civilians, women and children, to their deaths. He offered them a way to preserve their honor while preserving their lives. One of the two prisoners agreed to return to the caves with this message. Gabaldon waited. An hour passed. He stood there, alone, exposed on the cliff tops, knowing that at any moment Japanese soldiers could emerge from those caves and cut him down. He had no backup, no supporting fire, nothing but his rifle and his ability to communicate across the cultural divide. Then something extraordinary began to happen. The prisoner returned, but not alone. Behind him came a Japanese officer, and behind the officer came soldiers, not one or two, but dozens, all carrying weapons, but not in a threatening manner. They emerged from the caves and sat down in front of Gabaldon. "My heart is in my throat," Gabaldon would later remember. "This is the first time in the campaign that I do not have the drop on the enemy. They all sit in front of me. They do not look like defeated men. They are proud and serious, as if they haven't really made up their minds. The best thing for me to do is to show self-assurance in my demeanor." Picture this scene. An 18-year-old Marine, 5'4", 123 pounds, standing alone in front of dozens of battle-hardened Japanese soldiers who still had their weapons. Behind them, in the caves, were hundreds more, soldiers and civilians, many wounded, all convinced that surrender meant torture and death. Gabaldon realized that these soldiers might have thought there would be hundreds of American troops waiting for them. Instead, there was just him. So he did the only thing he could do. He took charge. He began giving orders, his voice confident, authoritative. He separated civilians from military personnel. He organized the wounded into one area for medical treatment. "I'm all over the place," he recalled. "There are many wounded, some seriously, but they have a lot of fight left in them." He was performing a one-man show, projecting the authority of the entire United States Marine Corps through sheer force of personality and his ability to communicate in the enemy's own language. More Japanese began emerging from the caves. Not just soldiers, but entire families, mothers with children, elderly civilians, wounded soldiers being helped by their comrades. The trickle became a stream, and the stream became a flood. By the end of that day, July 8, 1944, Guy Gabaldon had convinced over 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender. The line of surrendering Japanese stretched throughout the afternoon as Gabaldon coordinated with U.S. authorities to process this massive group. Think about what this meant in real terms. Each of these 800 people had been prepared to die. Many of the civilians had been given grenades by Japanese military authorities to kill themselves and their children. They had been told repeatedly that Americans were monsters who would commit unspeakable atrocities. Yet here they were, walking toward American lines because one young Marine had convinced them that the propaganda was wrong, that they would be treated with dignity, that their lives had value even in defeat. The military significance of this achievement cannot be overstated. In conventional combat, taking 800 enemy positions would have required a major military operation. It would have meant bombardment, assault, casualties on both sides. How many Americans would have died trying to clear those caves? How many Japanese would have fought to the death or committed suicide? Instead, they walked out peacefully, their lives saved by words rather than bullets. But the human significance was even greater. Among those 800 were not just soldiers but civilians, women who had been prepared to throw their children and themselves off cliffs, children who had been told they would be eaten by American cannibals, elderly people who had lived their entire lives on Saipan and were about to see it destroyed. Each of these lives saved was a victory against the propaganda and hatred that drove the Pacific War to such extremes of violence. Marine Corps records would officially credit Gabaldon with capturing 800 enemy personnel on July 8th, though Gabaldon himself and several witnesses suggested the number was even higher. His commanding officer, Captain John Schwabe, the same man who had threatened him with court-martial for his first unauthorized patrol, was so impressed that he recommended Gabaldon for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was extraordinary. Schwabe pointed out that Gabaldon had single-handedly captured more than 10 times the number of prisoners taken by Sergeant Alvin York in World War I, and York had received the Medal of Honor for his achievement. But something happened to that recommendation as it moved up the chain of command. When it reached General Holland Smith, it was downgraded to a Silver Star. Why? The official reasons were never made clear, but Gabaldon and many others believed they knew the answer. In 1944, the Marine Corps was still, as that documentary producer noted, mostly a bunch of white guys. A Mexican-American private from East LA didn't fit the image of what a Medal of Honor recipient should look like. The discrimination wasn't official, wasn't written down anywhere, but it was real nonetheless. Meanwhile, Gabaldon continued his work. Even after his extraordinary achievement on July 8th, he kept going out on his lone wolf patrols, kept talking Japanese soldiers and civilians out of their caves and hiding places. The battle for Saipan would officially end on July 9, 1944, but pockets of Japanese resistance continued for weeks. Gabaldon worked tirelessly to convince these holdouts to surrender. His methods remained consistent. He would approach Japanese positions carefully, get close enough to be heard, but not so close that frightened soldiers would shoot reflexively. He would speak in his conversational Japanese, addressing them not as enemies but as human beings. He would talk about practical things, food, medical care, the treatment of prisoners. He would point out the reality of their situation, cut off, without supplies, facing inevitable defeat. But most importantly, he would offer them dignity in surrender. The Marine Corps records show that Gabaldon's approach differed fundamentally from standard military interpreters. While others used bullhorns to demand surrender in formal military Japanese, Gabaldon spoke colloquially, respectfully, using the language patterns and cultural knowledge he'd learned from the Nakanos. This wasn't just about translation, it was about cultural understanding, about recognizing the human beings behind the enemy uniforms. By the time Gabaldon was wounded in a machine gun ambush late in the Saipan campaign, he had been credited with capturing approximately 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians. Think about that number. 1,500 people who were supposed to fight to the death or commit suicide, instead, walking peacefully into American custody, because one Marine understood that communication could be more powerful than combat. The wound from that machine gun ambush ended Gabaldon's combat service. He was evacuated to Hawaii and eventually received a medical discharge from the Marine Corps. He left the service with the rank of corporal and that Silver Star that should have been a Medal of Honor. But his story was far from over. After the war, Gabaldon returned to civilian life. But he couldn't simply go back to being the kid from East LA. He had seen too much, done too much. He moved to Mexico and set up various business ventures. He tried to build a normal life. But how do you return to normal after you've saved 1,500 lives in one of history's most brutal wars? In 1957, something unexpected happened. Gabaldon was featured on This Is Your Life, a popular television program. The show brought together Marine Corps intelligence officers who had served with him, Colonel Walter Layer, John Schwabe, who had been promoted to colonel, Major James High, and several enlisted men from military intelligence. On national television, they verified his claims. Yes, this young Marine had really captured 1,500 enemy personnel. Yes, he had really convinced 800 to surrender in a single day. The story that seemed too incredible to be true was confirmed by multiple witnesses. Hollywood took notice. In 1960, Allied artists released Hell to Eternity, a film about Gabaldon's life and wartime service. In a telling bit of Hollywood racism, The Mexican-American Gabaldon was portrayed by Jeffrey Hunter, a Scottish-American actor. Even in celebrating his achievements, American culture couldn't quite accept him as he was. But the movie had an unexpected effect. The publicity around it led to a review of Gabaldon's military decorations. In 1960, his Silver Star was upgraded to a Navy Cross, the second highest decoration the Navy could award. It still wasn't the Medal of Honor that Captain Schwabe had recommended, but it was recognition that his achievement had been extraordinary. Gabaldon spent the rest of his life advocating for veterans and working with troubled youth. He understood what it was like to be an outsider, to be underestimated, to have to prove yourself in a world that didn't quite accept you. He worked particularly with youth in Saipan, coming full circle to help young people on the island, where he had saved so many lives. Never stopped believing that he deserved the Medal of Honor. It wasn't about personal glory. Gabaldon had proved his courage beyond any doubt. It was about recognition, about acknowledging that a Mexican-American from the barrio could be just as much of a hero as anyone else. "I hate using the race card," he told reporters. But he knew that race had played a role in the downgrading of his medal. In 2001, Congress passed a law requiring the secretary of each military department to review the service records of Jewish American and Hispanic American war veterans who had received high decorations, to determine if any of them should have received the Medal of Honor but were denied due to discrimination. Gabaldon's case was submitted for review. As of his death, that review was still pending. Guy Gabaldon died on August 31, 2006, of heart disease. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, taking his place among America's honored war dead. The mayor of Los Angeles and the entire city council prepared a resolution requesting the Medal of Honor for Gabaldon, sending it to the White House. The request went nowhere. But medals and honors don't tell the real story of Guy Gabaldon. The real story is in those 1,500 lives he saved. Not just the Japanese soldiers and civilians who surrendered to him, but all their descendants, all the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist today because Guy Gabaldon convinced their ancestors that life was better than death, that surrender could be honorable, that enemies could show mercy. Think about the multiplication of those lives saved. Each person who walked out of those caves instead of fighting to the death or committing suicide went on to have a life after the war. They had families, careers, contributed to the rebuilding of Japan. Their children grew up in a world at peace, never knowing that they owed their existence to a young Marine who spoke their grandparents' language and convinced them to live. This is what makes Guy Gabaldon's story so extraordinary. In a war defined by its brutality, by the dehumanization of the enemy, by propaganda that turned human beings into monsters, he insisted on seeing the humanity in his enemies. He didn't go out on those lone wolf patrols to win glory or medals. He went out because he understood something that military strategists had missed. These weren't just enemy soldiers. They were human beings who had been lied to, who were afraid, who needed someone to show them another way. The tactics Gabaldon used, approaching enemy positions alone, speaking their language, offering dignified surrender, went against everything the Marine Corps taught. Marines were trained to kill the enemy, not to save them. They were taught to work as a unit, not to operate alone. They were taught that Japanese soldiers would never surrender, that the only way to defeat them was to kill them all. But Gabaldon had learned different lessons on the streets of East LA and in the home of the Nakano family. He had learned that people, even enemies, could be reached through understanding and communication. He had learned that courage wasn't just about facing death, but about taking risks for peace. He had learned that one person, even a small, young person without rank or authority, could make a difference if they had the right skills and the courage to use them. The numbers tell one story: 1,500 enemy personnel captured. 800 in a single day, a military record that stands to this day. But the human story is so much richer. Every conversation Gabaldon had with a frightened Japanese soldier. Every time he convinced a mother not to throw her children off a cliff. Every moment he stood alone and vulnerable, offering mercy instead of death. These were acts of profound moral courage. In military history, we celebrate warriors who kill the enemy in great numbers. We give medals for destroying enemy positions, for acts of violence in service of victory. But what Gabaldon did was something different and, in its way, more difficult. He saved the enemy from themselves. He fought against the logic of war itself, insisting that there was another way, that enemies could become prisoners, that prisoners could be treated with dignity, that today's enemy could be tomorrow's friend. The Marine Corps motto is Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Gabaldon embodied this in a way the Corps perhaps didn't expect. He was faithful not just to his country or his fellow Marines, but to a deeper principle, the value of human life, even enemy life. In a war where both sides had been taught to see each other as less than human, he insisted on recognizing the humanity in everyone. Consider the moral complexity of what Gabaldon achieved. The Japanese soldiers and civilians he saved were not innocent bystanders. Many were combatants who had killed or would have killed Americans. The military logic of the time said they should die, either in combat or by their own hands. Resources spent on prisoners were resources not available for American troops. Every Japanese soldier who survived was theoretically one who could fight again. But Gabaldon understood something that pure military logic missed. The war would end someday, and the enemies of today would have to live in the same world tomorrow. Every life saved, even an enemy life, was a step toward that future peace. Every Japanese soldier who surrendered and was treated well became evidence against the propaganda that had driven the war to such extremes. This understanding came from his unique background. Growing up Mexican-American in Los Angeles, Gabaldon knew what it was like to be seen as the other, to be stereotyped and dismissed. Living with the Nakano family, he had seen Japanese Americans, people who looked like the enemy, as family, as fully human. This dual perspective, this ability to see across the divisions that war creates, was his greatest weapon. When we think about heroism in war, we usually think about physical courage, charging machine gun nests, holding positions against overwhelming odds, sacrificing oneself for one's comrades. All of these are indeed heroic. But what Gabaldon did required a different kind of courage, the courage to defy expectations, to challenge the logic of war itself, to risk not just his life but his reputation and military career for the chance to save enemy lives. Every time Gabaldon went out on one of his lone wolf patrols, he was taking an extraordinary risk. Not just the physical risk of being killed by Japanese soldiers, but the risk of being wrong. What if his approach hadn't worked? What if the Japanese soldiers had used his mercy against him, pretending to surrender only to attack? What if his saved prisoners had somehow escaped and killed Americans? The safe, militarily sound approach would have been to follow orders, to stay with his unit, to kill the enemy like he was trained to do. But Gabaldon couldn't do that. He had a gift, his language skills, his cultural understanding, and he felt compelled to use it. He saw an opportunity to short-circuit the deadly logic of the Pacific War, to save lives on both sides, and he took it despite the risks and despite the opposition of his superiors. The resistance he faced from the military establishment is telling. His first captures resulted in threats of court-martial. Even after he proved his methods worked, even after he achieved the extraordinary capture of 800 enemy personnel in a single day, the military establishment couldn't quite accept what he had done. The Medal of Honor recommendation was downgraded. His achievement was acknowledged, but not fully celebrated. Part of this was certainly racism. A Mexican-American hero didn't fit the image the Marine Corps wanted to project in 1944, but part of it was also discomfort with what Gabaldon represented. He had succeeded not by being a better killer, but by refusing to kill when he didn't have to. He had achieved military objectives through communication rather than violence. He had treated the enemy as human beings worthy of life and dignity. This challenged fundamental assumptions about how wars were fought and won. In the years after the war, as the full horror of the Pacific War became clear, the atomic bombs, the firebombing of cities, the millions of deaths, Gabaldon's approach looked more and more like wisdom. He had found a way to achieve military objectives while preserving human life. He had demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, there was room for mercy, for understanding, for seeing the enemy as human. The tragedy of Saipan makes Gabaldon's achievement even more remarkable. Historians estimate that up to 1,000 Japanese civilians committed suicide on Saipan, many by jumping from the cliffs that would become known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. Entire families died together, mothers throwing their children off cliffs before jumping themselves, convinced that capture by Americans meant torture and death. Against this backdrop of mass suicide and hysteria, Gabaldon's success in convincing 800 people to surrender in a single day seems almost miraculous. Each person he convinced to surrender was someone who had been prepared to die, who had been told that death was preferable to capture, who had possibly watched friends and family members kill themselves rather than surrender. How did he do it? The answer lies not in any single technique or trick, but in the complete package of who Guy Gabaldon was. His street Japanese, learned from the Nakano family, allowed him to communicate in a way that felt genuine rather than foreign. His understanding of Japanese culture, also from the Nakanos, allowed him to frame surrender in terms that preserved honor rather than destroying it. His own experience as an outsider in American society gave him empathy for people caught between impossible choices. And his street smarts from East LA gave him the confidence and quick thinking to manage incredibly dangerous situations. But perhaps most importantly, Gabaldon genuinely wanted to save these people. This wasn't about glory or career advancement. Remember, his initial efforts got him threatened with court-martial. This was about a young man who saw unnecessary death and decided to prevent it. When he spoke to Japanese soldiers and civilians in those caves, they could hear in his voice that he meant what he said, that he really did want them to live, that he would ensure they were treated well. The specifics of how Gabaldon spoke to the Japanese reveal the sophistication of his approach. He didn't demand unconditional surrender or threaten violence. Instead, he reframed the situation. He pointed out that continuing to fight meant certain death. He could point to the American ships offshore, to the advancing American forces. He emphasized that surrender would be honorable, that they would be treated with dignity. Most cleverly, when speaking to soldiers who were protecting civilians, he argued that leading civilians to their deaths violated the Bushido code that demanded the protection of innocents. This wasn't manipulation. It was translation, not just of language but of values. Gabaldon was finding ways to bridge the gap between American military objectives and Japanese cultural values. He was showing that surrender didn't have to mean dishonor, that living didn't mean betraying everything they believed in. The patience Gabaldon showed was extraordinary. Military records indicate he would spend hours outside caves talking continuously, allowing fear to subside gradually. He understood that these people had been subjected to intense propaganda, that their fear of Americans was genuine and deep. He couldn't simply order them to surrender. He had to slowly, patiently convince them that the propaganda was wrong. This patience contradicted everything about the American military approach to the Pacific War. The island-hopping campaign was about speed, about taking objectives quickly and moving on to the next target. The Marine Corps culture emphasized aggressive action, overwhelming force, decisive violence. But Gabaldon understood that saving lives required a different tempo, a willingness to wait, to let people process new information that contradicted everything they had been told. The role of the Nakano family in shaping Gabaldon cannot be overstated. They didn't just teach him Japanese. They taught him to see Japanese people as fully human at a time when American propaganda was doing exactly the opposite. The same kind of dehumanization that Japanese propaganda applied to Americans was being applied in reverse. Americans were taught to see Japanese soldiers as fanatics, as inhuman enemies who had to be exterminated. But Gabaldon had lived with a Japanese family. He had eaten their food, celebrated their holidays, learned their language at their dinner table. When he looked at Japanese soldiers, he didn't see inhuman fanatics. He saw people like the Nakanos, people who had been caught up in forces beyond their control, people who deserved the chance to live if that chance could be offered. This personal connection to Japanese culture gave Gabaldon's words a credibility that no amount of military training could have provided. When he spoke to Japanese soldiers and civilians, they heard not an American military interpreter reading from a script, but someone who understood their language in all its subtlety, who could joke and reassure and argue in ways that felt natural and genuine. The impact of Gabaldon's actions extended far beyond the lives he directly saved. Every Japanese soldier who surrendered and was treated well became a living contradiction to Japanese propaganda. Word spread through the Japanese forces that Americans were not the monsters they had been told about. This potentially saved lives throughout the Pacific Campaign, as it became slightly easier for Japanese soldiers to consider surrender. Moreover, the Japanese civilians and soldiers Gabaldon saved would return to Japan after the war and help reshape Japanese understanding of Americans. Instead of stories of American atrocities, they had stories of a young Marine who spoke their language and saved their lives. These stories, multiplied across the 1,500 people Gabaldon saved, helped lay the groundwork for the post-war reconciliation between Japan and America. Think about the alternative history if Gabaldon hadn't done what he did. Those 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians would have died, either in combat, killing Americans as they died, or by suicide. The cliffs of Saipan would have claimed even more victims. The cycle of violence and hatred would have deepened. The mutual dehumanization that characterized the Pacific War would have been reinforced. Instead, Gabaldon created 1,500 small breaks in that cycle. Each person he saved was evidence that the war didn't have to be fought to the last death, that enemies could show mercy, that survival was possible even in defeat. In a war characterized by its lack of prisoners, by the refusal of quarter on both sides, Gabaldon insisted on a different way. The personal cost to Gabaldon of his actions is worth considering. Every time he went out on a lone wolf patrol, he was alone with his fear. He had no backup, no one to help if things went wrong. The stress of repeatedly putting himself in mortal danger, of managing these incredibly tense negotiations where any wrong word could mean death, must have been extraordinary. And then there was the psychological burden of success. When you save 1,500 lives, you also take responsibility for them in some way. Gabaldon had promised these people they would be treated well. What if they weren't? What if something went wrong after they surrendered? The weight of those promises, those lives entrusted to his word, must have been heavy. After the war, Gabaldon's life took many turns. He moved to Mexico, started businesses, worked with troubled youth. But he never forgot what had happened on Saipan. In interviews late in his life, you can hear both pride and frustration. Pride in what he had accomplished. Frustration that it hadn't been fully recognized. The fight for recognition wasn't just about Gabaldon. It was about what America was willing to celebrate, what kind of heroism it was willing to acknowledge. The traditional war hero kills the enemy in great numbers. Gabaldon saved the enemy in great numbers. The traditional war hero follows orders and works with his unit. Gabaldon disobeyed orders and worked alone. The traditional war hero in 1944 looked like John Wayne. Gabaldon was a small Mexican-American kid from the barrio. The 1960 movie, Held to Eternity, brought Gabaldon's story to a wider audience, but even then, Hollywood couldn't quite get it right. Casting a white actor to play Gabaldon was more than just Hollywood racism. It was a failure to understand that Gabaldon's identity as an outsider, as someone who could see across cultural divides, was essential to his achievement. A Scottish-American actor might look the part of a Hollywood hero, but he couldn't embody the complex identity that allowed Gabaldon to do what he did. In his later years, Gabaldon became an advocate for recognition of Hispanic and Jewish-American war heroes who had been overlooked or under-recognized. He understood that his fight wasn't just personal, it was about challenging the narratives of who could be a hero, whose contributions counted, whose stories got told. The 2001 congressional law requiring review of decorations for Hispanic and Jewish American veterans was partly a response to cases like Gabaldon's. The fact that such a law was necessary, more than 50 years after World War II ended, tells us something about how deeply embedded discrimination was in military culture. How many heroes had been overlooked because they didn't fit the expected image. When Gabaldon died in 2006, his case for the Medal of Honor was still pending review. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, taking his place among America's war dead. But the Medal of Honor he believed he deserved, that his commanding officer had recommended him for, remained elusive. In 2006, the mayor of Los Angeles and the entire city council sent a resolution to the White House requesting the Medal of Honor for Gabaldon. Veterans groups continued to advocate for him. Documentary filmmakers told his story. But bureaucracy moves slowly, and discrimination, even when acknowledged, is hard to rectify retroactively. Yet medals and official recognition, while important, don't capture the full measure of Guy Gabaldon's achievement. His true monument is not in bronze or marble, but in the lives that continued because of his actions. The children and grandchildren of those he saved, the families that weren't destroyed, the cycle of violence that was interrupted, if only briefly, by one young man's insistence on seeing enemies as human beings worthy of life. What Gabaldon did on Saipan challenges our understanding of warfare, heroism, and humanity. In a conflict defined by its brutality, by the dehumanization of the enemy, by the demand for total victory or total death, he found a third way. Not through grand strategy or superior firepower, but through the simple act of communication, through the radical insistence that even enemies could be reached with the right words, the right approach, the right understanding. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many lives could have been saved in the Pacific War if there had been more Guy Gabaldons? How many Japanese soldiers and civilians died unnecessarily because the American military didn't have, or didn't use, people who could communicate with them effectively? How many cycles of violence throughout history could have been broken if someone had been willing and able to speak across the divide of hatred and fear? These questions don't have easy answers, and Gabaldon's example isn't easily replicated. His unique combination of language skills, cultural understanding, street smarts, and raw courage came together at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place. You can't train that in military school. You can't mass-produce it. It emerged from the specific circumstances of his life, the poverty of East LA, the kindness of the Nakano family, the discrimination he faced, the opportunities he seized. But if we can't replicate Gabaldon's specific achievement, we can learn from his example. We can remember that enemies are human beings, that communication can be more powerful than violence, that understanding the other side's culture and values can open doors that weapons cannot. We can remember that heroism comes in many forms, not all of them violent, not all of them expected. We can also remember the cost of not recognizing heroes like Gabaldon. How many young Mexican Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, and others have had their contributions minimized or ignored because they didn't fit the expected image? How many acts of moral courage have gone uncelebrated because they didn't involve killing the enemy? How many opportunities for peace have been missed because we celebrated warriors more than peacemakers? Guy Gabaldon's story is particularly relevant today. In a world still divided by cultural misunderstandings, where propaganda still turns humans into monsters, where cycles of violence still seem impossible to break, his example reminds us that one person with the right skills and the courage to use them can make an extraordinary difference. That understanding and communication can achieve what force alone cannot. That seeing the humanity in our enemies might be the first step toward ending the conflicts that divide us. The boy from East LA who learned Japanese from his adoptive family, who saved 2,500 enemy lives in one of history's most brutal wars, who was denied the highest military honor because he didn't fit the image of a hero. His story is American history at its most complex and compelling. It's a story of discrimination and courage, of violence and mercy, of war and the possibility of peace even in war's midst. As we near the end of this account, it's worth returning to that moment on July 8, 1944, when Guy Gabaldon stood alone on the cliffs of Saipan, watching 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians emerge from their caves to surrender. Each of those people had been prepared to die. The soldiers had been ordered to die. The civilians had been told that death was preferable to capture. The entire weight of Japanese military culture, propaganda, and honor codes pushed them toward death. But one 18-year-old Marine offered them another choice. Not surrender or death, but life with dignity. Not defeat or victory, but survival and the possibility of a future after war. It was a choice that shouldn't have been possible, that military experts said was impossible, that went against everything both sides had been taught about this war. Yet it happened. 800 people who should have died that day lived instead. They lived because Guy Gabaldon saw them not as enemies to be destroyed, but as human beings to be saved. They lived because he had the skills to reach across the deadly divide of war and offer them hope. They lived because one young man had the courage to defy orders, to risk everything, to insist that there was another way. This is the powerful emotional truth at the heart of Guy Gabaldon's story. In the midst of humanity's most destructive war, one person chose creation over destruction, life over death, understanding over hatred. He didn't end the war. He didn't change military strategy. He didn't become the hero that America expected or celebrated. But for 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians, he was the difference between life and death. For their families, their descendants, everyone whose life was touched by theirs, he was the Marine who came speaking their language, offering mercy, proving that enemies could be more than enemies, that war didn't have to mean the death of everyone on the other side. Guy Gabaldon died on August 31, 2006. But his legacy lives on, not just in military history books or documentaries, but in every life that exists today because he saved an ancestor in 1944. Somewhere in Japan, in America, around the world, there are people who are alive because a young Marine from East LA learned Japanese from his adoptive family and used that knowledge to save lives rather than take them. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of Guy Gabaldon's story. The skills that allowed him to save all those lives weren't military skills. They were human skills: language, empathy, cultural understanding, the ability to see past uniforms and propaganda to the human beings underneath. These skills came not from Marine training, but from a childhood of hardship and diversity, from living between cultures, from being an outsider who learned to navigate different worlds. In a military culture that valued conformity, Gabaldon's differences made him extraordinary. In a war that demanded hatred of the enemy, his ability to see the enemy's humanity made him irreplaceable. In a situation where violence seemed the only answer, his commitment to communication saved more lives than any weapon could have.